morning. On behalf of my co-founders of ION, my brother Geoff and Father Tom, I'd like to welcome y'all to the ION Dialogues. We're pleased and honored that y'all are here. And the genesis of this event is to try to think of something to commemorate the 25th anniversary of ION's approval and groundbreaking. And originally we started off with the idea of, well, let's get the band back together. The Joe Cole and Victor Dover and Andres Duani and Jeff Speck and others who had a hand in designing ION initially back in 1995. And then it evolved into, well, let's invite others who've we've worked with on other projects and who've inspired our thinking over the last 25 years. And while at it, let's see what we can do to blow up this institutionalized exclusionary mindset that stunts the collective imagination and plagues urban design. And so then it became a situation like the dog that chases the car and actually catches it, and then is trying to figure out what to do with all these smart people who've accepted our invitation. Fortunately, Ann Tyler Howell was here to help pull it all together. Ann Tyler. Otherwise, I can assure you we would not be so organized. So, since it was first proposed in 1995, ION has been controversial, and that's okay. You know, to quote Martin Luther King Jr., and by now y'all probably realize I like to do that, there are some things in our society and some things in our world which I'm proud to be maladjusted. We own our maladjustedness and feel something of a moral imperative and sense of duty to try and make our corner of the world more beautiful. We're not afraid of controversy, and in fact, we're hoping you as fellow provocateurs will join us in creating some constructive tension. Let's not be afraid to roll a few hand grenades out in the middle of the room and see what happens. We don't want to finish tomorrow night and say, damn it, we just weren't radical enough. If nothing else, maybe we'll raise the level of discourse on beauty and the built environment and learn from one another. And in the process, enjoy the low country fall and have a good time. A number of people who weren't able to make it because of various conflicts, just want to mention Kirk Sale, Witold Rubczynski, David Cayley, John Norquist, Robert and Daryl Davis, Jonathan Pajot, Liz Plater-Zyberk. Someone had to work while Andres was off frolicking. And David Couch, a dear friend and the developer of Summerfield Farms and Summerfield, North Carolina, outside Greensboro, who Misty and Victor and Joe and others and I have been working on for some time. That's okay though; they're all here in spirit. Chuck Marone is supposed to come. Ann Tyler, he's still on the way? His flight got delayed last night, so we hope to see him after lunch. Anyway, let's get radical, shall we? The first definition of radical in the dictionary is of or related to the root of a thing. So we're going to get radical about urbanism, especially those shared places we own together. If you pollute the public realm, you degrade the common good. If you beautify the public realm, it enhances the common good. Now, I've long been intrigued by political theory as it relates to the built environment. Hannah Arendt observed the public realm gathers us together and prevents us from falling over each other, but that the modern public realm had lost its power to do that. What happened? What is it about the modern public realm that degrades our ability to relate to one another? Does it have to do with the story we tell ourselves? You'll remember the 1999 movie, The Matrix. It advanced basically machines, the plot centers around machines which distract unsuspecting humans in a simulated dream world while they suck the life out of them. The plot centers around a small group of rebels who try to save humanity before it's too late. In one scene, Matrix agents torture a captured rebel. The lead agent shares his view of humans as a virus that multiplies, consuming natural resources. He says humans are a disease and we, the soulless Matrix, are the cure. And while it's important to acknowledge limits, the human racism narrative that people are bad and more or worse is something that many of us have battled all our lives. God's urban design guidelines in the 35th chapter of Numbers, in which Moses receives instructions for laying out 48 cities for the Levites in the Promised Land, each of which is to have suburbs around it for food supplies, beyond which is wilderness. In specifying boundaries, I've wondered if God was suggesting walls for human protection or to protect the environment from humans. Setting boundaries has long been good urban practice. Jericho, at 10,000 years, the world's oldest continuously occupied city, also has the oldest walls. Jerusalem, Rome, and back in the day, Charleston. Now, adjusting boundaries used to involve careful deliberation. This is a map of Charleston in 1849. At the time, what you see in red there is now Calhoun Street. It used to be called Boundary Street. There had been this growth in the Charleston suburbs north of there, and a 77-member committee was appointed to adjust the line. It was led by Christopher Meminger and Jacob on I'On. This neighborhood is named after I'On. And anyway, there's a lot of deliberation on moving it and what would happen, what political representation would be, the budgets, all those things. And so today we don't give quite the same, we're not as circumspect as we once were. Since World War II, it's a little bit more willy-nilly. Charleston was, until 1960, it was just the peninsula, and then in the 60s, it began to annex into West Ashley, and now it's roughly 72,000 acres. It's sprawled all over the Charleston area. So the boundaries are not clear. It's a little confused. Now, I want to talk a little bit about infrastructure funding and how funding infrastructure changed dramatically between 1787 and 1907. I'll introduce you to John Rutledge, who is buried in the St. Michael's churchyard. And Rutledge was, during the Constitutional Convention, which was held in a room about this size, he was voted, he received the most votes, and he became the chairman of the Committee of Detail, five-man Committee of Detail, halfway through the convention. And at the end of the convention, one of the last debates was over infrastructure funding. Ben Franklin proposed that Congress be empowered to fund infrastructure, but the small states voted that down, 8-3. The larger states, led by Pennsylvania and Virginia, with the exception of George Mason, I might add, they sought to empower Congress, but the small states wouldn't have it. But between the time of Washington and James Buchanan, presidents vetoed 52 congressional bills. 45 of these took place between 1817 and 1860, and of those 45, 21 were over congressional bills to fund infrastructure. James Madison was the first to do this. He vetoed a bill sponsored by Henry Clay and John Calhoun. Also during this period, a new movement emerged pushing for more centralized state control over resources. Marx and Engels had a 10-plank manifesto, which included a heavy progressive income tax, state control of credit by means of a national bank, and centralization of communications and transportation in the state. They also proposed gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of population over the country. So you read this and you wonder if maybe sprawl is a communist plot. In the US, this push for more centralized control was evidenced by the Whig Party's push for a greater federal role in funding infrastructure, and the Whigs, which evolved in the Republican Party in the 1850s, led this effort. But presidents continued to veto transportation bills such as this one Congress passed in early 1860, vetoed by Buchanan. Now, historians acknowledge sectional differences between differences over higher tariff rates and how that contributed to war, but they usually focus on the protectionist nature of those tariffs. The 17-plank Republican platform of 1860 says what the money generated from the higher tariff would be used for. Plank 12 said to encourage the development of industrial interests. Plank 15, appropriations by Congress would be used for the accommodation and security of an existing commerce, that those would be authorized by the Constitution. And 16, a railroad to the Pacific Ocean was imperatively demanded by the interests of the whole country. Now, Lincoln was elected in November, South Carolina seceded in December, and 6 other states followed over the next few months. When the Confederacy was organized in February 1861, a Charleston attorney, Christopher Memminger, led the committee that drafted a new constitution. A deplorable aim of the convention was to protect the institution of slavery, but there was much more to it than that. The leadership wanted to edit language of the U.S. Constitution to clarify ambiguous language that had resulted and continues to result in argument and strife over interpretation. They sought to create a free trade zone and provide safeguards against crony capitalism. They had long observed emerging. For example, to the 3rd clause of Article 1, Section 8, they want to make it clear that the purpose of Congress's taxing powers was for revenue necessary to pay specific items. And by forbidding bounties and denying the ability to tax imports to promote any branch of industry, the CSA in one swoop bans trade protectionism and corporate welfare. Spared such burdensome costs, one can conclude the aim was to position the Confederacy as a free trade zone. Clause 3 reaffirmed prohibition on corporate welfare by forbidding any infrastructure spending intended to facilitate commerce. In his inaugural address on March 4th, Lincoln began by promising never to touch slavery and endorsed the Corwin Amendment that would have prohibited the federal government from interfering with it. But a week after Lincoln's inauguration, the Confederate Constitution was made public, and the aim to establish a free trade zone became clear. A flurry of alarmist editorials followed in northern papers. The Philadelphia Press on March 18th blockade southern ports with no protective tariff. European goods will underprice northern goods on southern markets. This will cripple the clothing industries and make British mills prosper. Boston Evening Transcript, the merchants of New Orleans, Charleston, and Savannah are possessed of the idea that New York, Boston, and Philadelphia may be shorn of their mercantile greatness by a revenue system verging on free trade. And the New York Times at once shut down every southern port, destroy its commerce, and bring utter ruin on the Confederacy. I'm not so much defending the Confederacy as I am just pointing out some of the history and some of the unknown that people don't realize about what led to the causes of war. And after federal troops were knocked out of Fort Sumter, what remaining sympathy for allowing the South to go its way dried up. After the war, in a famous correspondence between Lord Acton, the British champion of liberty, and Robert E. Lee, Acton mentioned the defects and abuses of principle which the Confederate Constitution was expressly and wisely calculated to remedy. Lee responded that although the South would have preferred compromise to war, she now accepted the constitutional amendment that ended slavery, noting that it was something that Virginians had long sought. He also affirmed a belief that the rights and authority reserved to the states and people were essential to the balance of the system and continuation of a free government. He expressed his concern that, quote, the consolidation of the states into one vast republic, sure to be aggressive abroad and despotic at home, will be the certain precursor of that ruin which has overwhelmed all those that have preceded it. In the decades to come, the Republican-appointed Supreme Court justices reinterpreted the Commerce Clause to be more in line with the Republican platform of 1860. There are four major decisions: the Wabash case, California versus Central Pacific Railroad, Monongahela Navigation versus the U.S., and Luxton versus North River Bridge. When the Colombian Senate refused to ratify the Hay-Haran Treaty, allowing the U.S. to purchase a leasehold in Panama Canal, Teddy Roosevelt sent in U.S. Navy ships to provide cover to Panamanian rebels who seceded from Colombia to form the Republic of Panama and promptly signed the deal with the U.S. It seems secession is okay when real estate is involved. In late 1906, Teddy Roosevelt became the first sitting U.S. president to travel outside the country on a PR trip to inspect the canal construction. And what immediately followed was the case, Supreme Court decision in Wilson v. Shaw, which authorized Congress to fund and construct interstate highways. What followed shortly thereafter, the Revenue Act of 1913, establishing an income tax, the Federal Reserve Act, establishing the Federal Reserve System, and all of a sudden the federal government had these huge resources and the ability to move forward on big projects. Federal Aid Road Act, first Federal Aid Road Act passed in 1916. It's just a visit with Harding and some of the folks involved in this new vision. The next Federal Aid Road Act in 1921, that established matching funds. In 1922, this book came out, so 100 years ago, basically looking at, calling for a return to the practice of civic art, looking at examples from Europe and America. There's pictures of that St. Michael's Church at the bottom and UVA, bottom right. But there was an alternative vision at the same time. Henry Ford said the problem of the city can be solved by eliminating the city. And then Corbu and his famous model for a contemporary city, replete with interstate highways and big towers running through the middle of it. So what do we do with all this money? Do we pursue the practice of civic art or this new vision? Well, the motor age won out, running over simple living without stopping to check on its victims. No better was this exemplified than in New York, where Robert Moses, with the help of mayors and governors, was rapidly advancing a road building agenda. Back to Charleston real quick, that was in 1931, the city hired Ohio-based engineer Morris Knowles, who had been one of the 8 original members of the U.S. Commerce Department's Advisory Committee on Zoning, and he was very adept at selling exclusionary land use segregation, which was even easier in the Jim Crow South of the time. That's when Charleston adopted zoning. Now, the World Road Congress, is anybody familiar with this organization? They hold these big congresses every 4 years, and in 1934, the first one was held in Munich, not the first one, but it started in Paris in 1908, but the one they held in Germany in 1934 was used by the Nazis to show off the Autobahn. All the friendly faces were there, like Rudolf Hess, who exclaimed construction of big roads is National Socialism in the best sense of the world, and of the word. I was driving the other day and took this picture. I saw the bumper sticker, and socialism sucks, and Well, I agree with that to some extent. It doesn't really scale very well beyond the family. But I thought of Rudolf Hess's quote and wondered if the driver of this truck had ever thought that the roads upon which he was driving were socialized at the national level. The American delegation to the Munich conference included representatives of the American Association of State Highway Officials, the Road Builders Association, the American Society of Civil Engineers, Harvard, MIT, AAA, and Standard Oil. On behalf of the delegation, Lawrence Hughes with the U.S. Bureau of Public Roads said it was a pleasure to add our own hearty appreciation for the results of the Road Congress, and we appreciate the scope and magnitude of the Audubon program and the vigor with which it is progressing. Now, Thomas McDonald was the chief of the Bureau of Public Roads between 1918, 1919, and 1953. He traveled to Germany in 1936 to meet with Mr. Hitler, as he called him, and his head engineer, Fritz Todt. Todt actually in Old German means death, believe it or not. When McDonald returned, he went on a cross-country barnstorming tour to promote the building of a system similar to the Audubon's, except his vision was not for big roads that went along the edge of cities like the Audubon did, but straight through them. McDonald's vision was illustrated in the 1939 publication Toll Roads and Free Roads. Here's a few images from that. This shows the highway slicing through the middle of a city. And the same report provided an early outline for what would come to be known as urban renewal, and advanced a blueprint for what would become the interstate highway system. Roosevelt endorsed the report on April 27th, then 3 days later traveled to New York City to open the World's Fair with its World of Tomorrow theme, of which General Motors' Futurama was the main attraction. If you look at the vision expressed in the Futurama and Toll Roads and Free Roads, it's pretty clear that there's too many similarities for it to be a coincidence. I suspect there was some kind of collaboration. Despite World War II going on, the Bureau of Public Roads continued to fine-tune the vision. Here's an image from the 1944 report on interregional highways. That's what the interstates were called before 1956. Back in small town Mount Pleasant, 17 years behind Charleston, the town adopted zoning for its then 300 acres. It's now 30,000 acres. It took a while, but the interstate vision was finally funded in 1956, and Eisenhower signed the bill. Kind of an inconvenient truth that Al Gore Sr. championed the bill through the Senate. Impacts in Charleston were immediate. With the widening of 17 west of Charleston, it was later announced that I-26 would be built into the heart of the city, and the Crosstown Expressway would bifurcate it, eviscerating mostly black neighborhoods. This road was subsequently renamed the Septima Clark Parkway after the civil rights leader. Not sure what she would have thought of that. Like many U.S. cities, Charleston was under siege, and the same thing was going on this side of the bridge in Mount Pleasant. With federal funds, US 17, now Coleman Boulevard, was widened. The town's boundary street was renamed Simmons Street, launching the era of sprawl, which continues to this day. So there's a quick summary of factors that contributed to the shift from a human scale to the inhuman scaled city. This is one of my favorite quotes from Scripture, is from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it, but small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." And so we're still caught in this soul-sucking matrix, and our policy is now to outlaw the narrow way and subsidize the broad way. And the vision continues. A quote from a speech President Obama gave in 2011. Here's one, everyone's favorite person to hate these days, Putin, espousing the same vision. Here's our local politicians supporting half-cent sales tax to widen and build more roads. bipartisan support continues, and this is what we do at our state level. So the antidote, continue to think that it's East beautiful, building beautiful towns. This is Craven Street in Beaufort. I moved here in 1989, became quite enamored with the town. I was working for a golf course community developer at the time. I realized that what they were offering there was they were attempting to offer privacy and exclusion. But what happens when you do that is every time a house gets built, you take away from what's being offered. And I realized that in a place like Beaufort, every house contributes to a sense of belonging and community and beauty. And so that was the model. My mentor at the time was Charles Frazier, who ironically was the lead developer of Hilton Head, which is more suburban in nature. But he was coming around to it, and he suggested that I go see Seaside, being developed by Robert and Daryl Davis, and meet this guy named Andre Duaney, as he called him, and look into that. So my boss at the time brought back a videotape of Andres's lecture at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and things that I'd been thinking about, it just all of a sudden, kind of scales fell from my eyes because Andres articulated it so clearly. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So the first neighborhood that we built, called New Point on Ladies Island outside of Beaufort, and my dad and brother contributed to that. We're involved in that too. And that ultimately led up here to this opportunity at I'On. The charrette, as I mentioned earlier, was in 1995. There was lots of opposition. We had a lot of support, thanks in huge part to the Coastal Conservation League, which Dana and Jason will talk about in a minute. This is an example of, it's kind of that matrix narrative, but Carlton Puldat was tough. He died a few years ago, but he was he's an engineer, former director of the Department of Engineering in the city of Charleston, a former town council member in Mount Pleasant, and he was very much against it, against our original proposal. He actually, when we were planning a roundabout, which right here, the roundabout out in front of I'On is the first modern roundabout in the state of South Carolina, but he said that South Carolinians were too dumb to be able to negotiate that, and it was certain to be a circle of death. It was an example of that. And we had other opposition from folks who actually ended up moving into the neighborhood after it was eventually approved. But this is an example of that. So I'On is much celebrated. We're really pleased with it. We're excited to share it with you. We engaged, there's hundreds, if not thousands of people who've been involved. It's basically a big participative civic art project. We had probably 30 builders, over 100 architects and designers, and it's an illustration of what can happen with a lot of people throwing their hearts into it. 25 years ago, it was recorded in 24 years ago, but Geoff and my dad and I set forth a number of goals. This is one, the final goal was to create an exemplary model which would inspire others to recapture the tradition of great urbanism and architecture. And so if we look at it objectively, I'On, and toward this goal, we don't know that we moved the needle very much on that, because Charleston continues to sprawl out. And but we haven't given up. And that's one reason why y'all are here, because we want to push the envelope and make it better. And so with that, I will turn it over to Dana.
Y'all, thank you very much. Welcome, and it's wonderful to be back here after, how long ago was the first ION dialogue? It was 5 years ago, and this has been one of the more enjoyable parts of the work I did over 30 years, to be involved with people who were so inspired and inspiring. Vince, of course, and Andres and Victor Dover and others who we have maintained relationships with. I wanted to mention that when we heard that fire truck out there, one of the biggest opponents of this design, I think early on, was the fire department, right? I mean, they had the big question about whether the fire trucks could get in, and I'm sure much design and discussion was done to make sure that was a possibility. When we came out, the Conservation League, which I started in 1989 and is in some ways a standard environmental group, we came out in support of ION. And one of the early reactions to that was from a friend of mine who lived in Hobcaw. And he called up, and he was also a member of the Conservation League, called up and said, "Why are you supporting development? Environmentalists are supposed to be opposed to all development." And it was a good question, really. He proceeded to withdraw his membership from the Conservation League. But the question made me realize and contemplate how we'd gotten where we got on, where we came to on this issue of how people can live in sustainable ways. When I started, I probably came to this aspect of urban planning from an avenue that was probably different than almost anybody in this room, and it was as a bird watcher. When we started the league, my colleague Jane LaRoe and I were avid birders, avid ecologists, and the thing that we were most concerned about was the loss of habitat. And as environmentalists, we scoured the statutes to see what of all of these various programs that existed at the state and federal level, which programs would allow us to stem this tide of sprawl across these beautiful landscapes. There were vernacular landscapes, there were natural landscapes, and all the damage that was being done in this area and all over the country. And what we found out is we really couldn't find any law that had any particular specific relevance to the question of land use and habitat. There was a Clean Water Act, as y'all know. In the 70s, we passed this barrage of federal legislation that was really revolutionary and important, critically important. Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act. The Coastal Zone Management Act actually was the consolation prize for the only major federal initiative that failed to pass in the 70s, and that was a National Land Use Act, which may not have been the worst thing that it didn't pass. But the bottom line was that as we explored the ways to come to terms with these aberrant patterns of land use, overly consumptive of land, overly destructive, wasteful, we really couldn't find anything in the repertoire of laws that gave us an awful lot of leverage. So what I did, and Geoff and I both went to Davidson as a good Davidson graduate, I decided I'd try to read as much as I could about what had been thought about and said about and written about land use over time. And I read all the books that all of you have read. I've read Lewis Mumford, Jane Jacobs. Kenneth Jackson was one of my favorites. Of course, Suburban Nation by Geoff and Andres, and which came out later. But those were the books that informed the Conservation League in how we could craft a program that would directly address this issue of better land use. And we came up with we tried to simplify it because it is a very confusing issue to talk to people about, as all of you know. we tried to simplify it. We said, really, there are two basic ideas here. One is to preserve this working landscape, the rural landscape. Benton Mackay called it the indigenous landscape, and the natural primeval landscape, he called it, and also to promote city building that is a different kind of pattern than we're seeing emerge here and really all over America. City building that achieves prosperous, humane, equitable patterns, environmentally sustainable, beautiful cities. And that became the goal of our land use program. And as I say, I have a number of people in this room to thank for crafting that, along with, and I think Andres actually turned me on to this wonderful book by Benton Mackay, written in the 1920s, called Regional Planning, The New Exploration. But Lewis Mumford, of course, and then Jim Kunstler and others were really helped us figure out what exactly, when we say we want to promote better land use, what does that actually mean? What do we do? We tried everything. This was the classic, throw it at the wall, and if it sticks, then it's a good thing. But in the early days, we promoted better city and county comprehensive plans. We pushed urban growth boundaries. We were enamored of Oregon's statewide land use planning program. We tried to see if we could get that, such a thing passed in South Carolina. And actually, Mark Sanford was here last night, but he was one of the advocates for that. Jim Hodges, another governor. Transportation reform. We're promoting Fix It First, pedestrian and bike allocations. We had a small schools initiative that ran into the buzzsaw of the South Carolina Department of Education. We held local design charrettes to look at particular areas, like, if you know those of you who do know Charleston, the Glenn McConnell so-called Parkway was built under the auspices of Mayor Joe Riley, and it really is an expressway, but we wanted to see if there was a way to make it more urban and more functional and more humane. But the one thing that how we got involved with ION is the one thing that gave us, I think, the most hope was that developers at the time, very few were coming in with plans to do things that we thought embodied these principles of urbanism that needed to be reenacted in America. And Vince was my most important influence, and when New Point was envisioned and built in Beaufort, we were just delighted that what we were promoting and talking about in concept was something that was actually being realized. And then when ION was proposed here, of course, that's sort of how we got on board. And that was the long answer to my friend's question, why are you promoting development? One thing that so to think about this in this sort of the two parts, one is what do you do outside of the city and what do you do in the city? We spent a lot of time mapping growth in this area to try to illustrate to people at a large scale the threat and the risk that we faced in the Lowcountry. This cherished landscape was being rapidly consumed by sprawl. And this is a map of I don't know if I have a laser here or not. Yeah, maybe I do. Oh. Doesn't work on that. Okay, anyway, well, you see that broad blue stripe at the top is the Santee River, and then a less broad blue stripe is the Edisto, and that really is pretty much the boundary of the Tri-County area. With the Lake Moultrie and Marion up at the top, those two big lakes. What we were looking at in 1973 was an urban area with a footprint of 45,000 acres. This is all of the land that had been developed since European settlement in 1670. I'm looking at Mackie Hill, who's going to correct my facts on this. Uh, but so the next 20 years saw a very different phenomenon than this 1670 through 1973. The next 20 years, we saw another 115,000 acres of land developed. It was an expansion of the urban area by 250%. As Vince noted, a lot of this was annexation by the city of Charleston and enabling new development out in the hinterlands. Population only grew 40% during that same time. So what we were looking at was a six-fold difference between land consumption and population growth. And this was true, as all of you know, I'm sure, this was a phenomenon playing out in metropolitan areas across America. And in fact, I've just been working in Henderson County, North Carolina, and the multiple there is 14 times land consumption to population growth. So we weren't even the worst. But we got together with Clemson University to try to figure out if we continued on this same path, where would we end up? Where would we end up with development? And the Strom Thurmond Institute developed it. We figured we had to have a bulletproof name behind it, and everyone believed Strom Thurmond. So they put together a model that mapped development based on projected population growth, looking at infrastructure and roads and highland and that sort of thing. And this is the projection Clemson made, and this was done in the 90s, for the metropolitan area in 2030. This is what we called, and pardon my French, the oh shit map. And people, when they saw this, were appalled. They saw these wonderful, cherished landscapes of the Ashley River, the Ace Basin, the Sea Islands being rapidly overrun by sprawl. And it was an organizing tool that allowed us to talk about the need to reform and also how to reform these patterns of growth. Meanwhile, the same time, over this roughly the same period, that red is, again, the urbanized area, and the green in 1985 was the protected land in the Low Country. And all it really represented was the Francis Marion National Forest and Cape Romaine. Over the next 30 years, that changed dramatically because of a lot of hard work by a lot of groups. And this, in 2017, I don't have a more recent map, but somewhat similar today, represented the protected landscape. And so here we're trying to realize Benton Mackay's primeval landscape. What does the green belt look like? And of course, all of you know the first green belt in the Western world was Queen Elizabeth I in London, around London. And so this was our vision for the external landscape beyond the city. And today, more than 1.25 million acres of land have been secured through permanent protection and another 200,000 through better planning and zoning. So we feel pretty good about the pattern of protection, but the internal part has been harder. And I guess I'm going to turn this over to Jason, who will talk about some of the trials and tribulations of reforming urban growth by simply saying what we learned over 30 years is that protecting farms, forest, and nature is pretty hard, but it is nothing compared to what you all have been doing in this room for so long, and so many of you have been leading on this effort, and that is reforming the pattern of urban growth in our cities and towns across America.
A real oh shit moment was I was sitting in a lecture once, a couple years ago, with the economic development director of Berkeley County, who had gotten his hands on Dana's growth projection maps and said, this is what we're aiming for by 2030. So you can use maps and weaponize them in different ways. So what Dana was talking about in relation to the projections, the rate, the policy work, the land use that through advocacy we had been promoting. So taking the principles and the theories and the work that you all had been doing, taking the ideas that Vince brought and put onto this land, and Vince saying, did we achieve our goal? I think the answer is yes, but it takes advocacy organizations like the Coastal Conservation League to constantly be vigilant and say, you're not doing it right, you can do it better, look at these models. Talking about the Greenbelt vision and the actual execution, there was a very strong effort for many years to keep that Glen McConnell Parkway, Expressway, moving out towards the Ashley River Historic District, places where Drayton Hall, Middleton Place, Magnolia Plantations are, if you're familiar with the Charleston region. Keep that highway continuing straight through the historic district to go up into Ridgeville. This is something that, to this day, as of a week ago, we were still fighting to get it removed off from a sales tax list, trying to get public funds to build highways. And about 10, 15 years ago, a developer in the outer neighborhood, that last furthest edge called Village Green, had bought all of the remaining land right around all the suburban developments to design a continuation of that same classic suburban model called Long Savannah. And again, taking the principles of ION and through advocacy, the Coastal Conservation League worked with that developer to bring in some very friendly faces here in this room to come up with a new concept, to take the idea of a civic art area, a place where you could have a walkable community, a true town center on the edge of the urbanized area, and create a green belt. Instead of building on every single inch of this property, have a terminus of our urban area, put the urban growth boundary on the edge of the developed area, and cap it with a county park, a public park space, to say this is the definitive boundary of the western side of our urbanized area. And there were a couple of reasons why we wanted to do this, and one very important one was a way to stop the Glen McConnell from continuing through the Ashley River Historic District, but instead to terminate in the middle of a town center of the Long Savannah development, so that you had a place and a destination to go to, and then if the highway builders wanted to keep building, they would have to plow through a new city. And it worked. It was through the advocacy of the Coastal Conservation League, bringing in designers who are here in this room today, and a developer who wanted to create something. He didn't want to just have the easy way out. He wanted to create something that he was proud of, to come together to come up with a plan and a design that worked for this area. Now, of course, we could keep talking about how terrible our annexation laws are and say that some cities can just hop over and go right behind and keep this going, but that would be a dissertation for another day. While this was going on, Midwest Vaco, the timber company, sold about 30,000 acres of land 20 miles north in Berkeley County to 4 major home builder developers in the region, and embarked on a Mount Pleasant scale suburban development that resulted in what you're seeing today. If you see the notice of change without a pointer, just keep your eyes looking at that. What you're seeing of the tentacles of Cane Bay here is that classic terrible sprawl model of suburban development. And this is, again, the socialized infrastructure responses. So because Berkeley County allowed this development, which is about 6,000 houses with a grocery store and 1 entrance, all filtering into a 2-lane highway, they approved this development, 10,000 people moved in, and suddenly they were all filtering out onto 1 single road with no town center, no commercial space, no destination in their community. They have to leave for every single thing. Suddenly, Berkeley County had to provide fire, they had to provide schools, they had to build the new road, they had to widen the road, and they, as a county, which used to have a model of open for business, now is changing their paradigm. They're shifting in their mindset because the cost of this sprawl is affecting this area. And today, they are investing in rural zoning, they're investing in a land conservation program, they're investing in all of the things that the Coastal Conservation League has been practicing for 30 years. It took a loss to get a gain here, but all the while we kept saying, we told you so, we told you so, but they came up with the bright ideas all on their own. Shifting from the west side of the Charleston area to cap this up of thinking about deliberate efforts to create boundaries. On the east side, the city of Charleston, the great Mayor Riley, on his way out the door, gave us the gift of Cainhoy, a 9,000-acre development approved for 18,000 residential units. That's 4 continuous miles from the southern tip to the northern tip at a density of about 2 units per acre. This was a place that Daniel Island and Cainhoy were annexed in the middle of the night, and it was considered and is considered the final frontier. Building this as proposed would cause an incredible strain and impact on the existing road, which Clements Ferry Road was a small 2-lane road. When I was in college, it was a dirt road for many years before that. They're currently widening it to a 4-lane highway. On the right is Highway 41 that was built through a historic African-American neighborhood, and Mount Pleasant annexed all around it, and the Charleston County's been trying to widen it to a 5-lane highway. We've been working on trying to get them to go around the historic African-American community. And then, of course, 526. So this development, as proposed, has a small commercial strip of land on Clements Ferry Road, and otherwise everything that you see there is just single-family housing. Every trip, every destination would be leaving Cainhoy because there is no community there. There is no center there. You cannot have a place where you can live, work, and play as the principles of new urbanism promoted. It would be a bedroom community that would cripple our infrastructure and cause, again, more of that socialized investment. And so for the last 10 years, the Coastal Conservation League, once again, has been advocating for the principles of new urbanism and the beauty of I'On, the ability to create a destination and a place that is walkable, a place that you can actually have a dense enough center and attainable enough mix of civic, commercial, residential uses to stay there, but also support the infrastructure like mass transit. On the left, you are 2 miles from the southern tip to Clements Ferry Road. Nobody's going to walk to a bus rapid transit line if they've got a 2-mile walk, and they're already getting in their car, so they're not going to drive from their home up to Clements Ferry Road, get out of their car, and get into a bus rapid transit system. But what Victor and his team showed us on the right was, with a little bit of effort, a little bit of creativity, and a little bit of civic mindset of how urbanism and town planning can work, you can have a place that follows the exact same goals of 9,000 or 18,000 units without building on every single inch of this property. The southern half also is almost wholly in the floodplain, and again, we were able to show how you could develop without going into the floodplain, and then you also avoid impacts to the largest longleaf pine savanna in the city of Charleston. You minimize the impacts to the Francis Marion National Forest. You keep people out of the floodplain. You keep people concentrated into an area that makes you want to be there as a place, instead of a place where you are just trying to drive through and get out of. I wanted to show this as this is the effort, again, of trying to create those boundaries, not saying we have to build all the way up to the Francis Marion National Forest, but that we can create a sense of place. We can put a bookend on the community, and developers can do it if there's a little bit of pressure put on them, but it takes the advocacy. Every community needs to have a Coastal Conservation League because we have to have the people who are advocating for good urbanism matched with conservation and land protection. Because if we just let the left happen, we are going to meet that map that showed 2030 with every single inch of the region developed. And with that, I'll open up to questions and discussion before I have to slip out.
One, I would definitely, I say Daniel Island undoubtedly. And there's a long and interesting story there, and somebody should write at least a monograph on it, because there were dueling designers, and Andres was part of it, and then Jack Robertson, whom I'm sure y'all know, came in, and Frank Brumley was involved, and a lot of push and pull to come up with what eventually became Daniel Island, which I would say is a much better version of a suburban development, and not as good as Ion. It was compromised, I think. But, you know, I think to the extent to which we were trying to show that land could be used more efficiently within the boundaries, that transportation, the trip links could be reduced, that trips could be distributed between cars and feet and bikes, a little bit less was taken away than we hoped, I think. I mean, Vince should speak, and Jason can speak to it, but I am not persuaded that that the public related Ion as much to this preservation of the rural landscape as we hope they might.
I would say that pretty much every developer in this region keeps an Ion version in their back pocket. They put the classic Park West, Dunes West, if you know these neighborhoods in Mount Pleasant here, they present those first, but they're prepared to bring in the better design if they get the pushback. And Long Savannah is a perfect example. That developer changed his plan, and another developer ended up buying that property that lives here in Ion, and he was a fan of Ion, he was a fan of Vince, he was a fan of this new urbanist idea, and he wanted to create one as well. Cainhoy is a harder one, because that is one that's just wholly designed by engineers. I mean, Thomas and Hutton created it, and this is an entitlement situation where it's not a developer who's trying to create a Daniel Island, even though it is the Daniel Island company developing it. This is a situation where they're getting it entitled to sell to home builders who are going to do their formula development unless they're told otherwise. And that's the constant challenge, and that's where the advocacy comes in. The zoning only goes so far. The beauty of urban design is not something you can do in zoning. And so it does take people wanting to see something else. And one of the challenges with the NIMBYism in our region right now, because there are so many people coming to this region, people are so overwhelmed by the growth, the pressure, the development, that they're opposed to everything. They don't even know what they want and don't want. They just don't want anything. And that's a challenge from advocacy side now, because we used to be able to always find our army of activists that would come out and say, we want this, we don't want that. But now it's becoming harder, because nobody wants anything, because we have so much. And this is one of those situations where the goose that laid the golden egg has been killed, and now we're eating the omelet as well. So it's a bit of a challenge to even be able to prop up one model because people are just so burnt out.
Just real quickly, I mean, again, without the league, ION would not be here. I would add to what's been said that there continue to be these misaligned incentives and disincentives. Development is a risky business, and developers they'll take the easiest path. There's to avoid the political risk, the financial risk, and when we continue to subsidize the sprawl, I mean, why would you be crazy enough to try to attempt an ION that is going to take several years in court and all these political battles? I think one of the fundamental problems I have with the conventional zoning paradigm is that it kind of zones people's mind, and it's just dumbs down the process of planning, and it's really harmful. So, Bob, you had your hand up. Well, again, I think the reason why there's not more ions is because it's just too hard to do. The laws basically prohibit it. And the second part of your question, no, the politics wouldn't allow it.
That was the part that I was going to say. The development that we're seeing today is very formulaic, based off from what the banks are lending post-recession. So if you drive downtown and you see the huge Texas donut-style apartment blocks, that is a response to the bank's lend to build luxury apartments. The tract home developments that the same engineers, two engineers in the city are developing, it's the safe model. So there are some crazy developers that aren't sitting up here that will try to do it, and there have been some successful ones, but it is the response to the market and the ability to get financing for these developments, because our cost of land and construction is so high now that you don't really have the ability to sit on a piece of property for a huge amount of time and go through the lawsuits. I think the zoning allows it. It just, people don't want to go through the trouble of trying. There are dense mixed use communities that are still being planned. They're just not moving at the clip that they're not as frequent, and they're not bringing the paintbrush in to design them because it's easier not to.
And I'd say one thing is the model of development, as you all know better than I do, but when you see most of these developers are just land resellers, and they get the entitlements for units, some sort of vague approval for a road system, and then they sell the land to parcels to D.R. Horton and one to Ryland and et cetera, and so there isn't a developer overseeing the overall evolution of these communities. They're tract builders, and that's unfortunately what is going to happen on this critically important property at Cainhoy. There will not be a developer, unlike certainly ION, but even Daniel Allen. The model is to sell these parcels off in wholesale, and the tract builders don't do new urbanism, at least around here. I'll tell you, it always inspires me to hear what Victor is doing down in South Florida, because there is vastly more new urbanism going on there than there is in this region, which I would say, and maybe I'm being parochial, has one of the best urban examples, models in America with Charleston. And the irony is, the city of Charleston's own zoning code prohibited the recreation of Charleston ever since its creation. And it still does. It still does. You cannot build Charleston today by right, but you can build sprawl by right in Charleston.
Well, I say that in terms of the PUD zonings. So ION's a PUD, right? Yeah, plan unit development. So
In theory, you could
yeah,
do it, but in practice,
correct. You can get PUD zoning. You could do an ION or a Habersham. You could do it. You know, when you guys go to Cat Fiddle tomorrow, you will see a crazy developer who did it in a way that didn't make sense economically. I mean, that infill development is not something that a developer looks at and says, I'm going to make a fortune off from a 10, 15 year long development of 10, 20 houses. But it was someone who wanted to create a civic mark on the landscape to show how infill development could work. I see Christian here. The Union Pier development is probably the closest. While it's not a suburban ION in the sense of you're going somewhere new to create something from the ground up. The Union Pier redevelopment downtown is a 60 some odd acre mixed use development that the approach that is being taken is an extension and continuation of the urban fabric, and it looks like Ansonboro. They're following the street patterns and building or designing a mixed use place that will be zoned PUD. So under its existing zoning of industrial, it couldn't be built, but through the process, the public process and engagement, we have the chance of creating something that is a continuation of the urban form, unlike some other developments downtown, like West Edge near my office, that is a enclave of Texas donut apartment buildings that look like you could be in any city.
You have to be a fanatic to build a new urbanist development.
and Tyler, Yeah. Andres?
First of all, I'd like to confirm all the intelligence of the discussion and the experience that we heard this morning. And plenty enough has been brought up to actually fill the next 2 days. A really, really smart experience stuff. I would like to emphasize one thing about the existing suburban system that astounds me. All the silos are integrated. What we have against us isn't evil, it's an incredibly well-working system in which the bankers, the zoning, the utility companies, the highway engineers, all the specialists of all the silos are integrated. The efficiency of suburban sprawl is amazing. It's an incredible machine in which everything collects. We're up against, we're being ground up by the gears that are actually working very smoothly. So that machine has to break. Okay, what I realize is that machine has to break. We can't just reform it or oil it or throw dirt at it. And something's coming up, which is the environmental issue and the larger climate change situation. And you know that for the first time, a deadline has been set that's not slippery. We have to be at 50% net carbon by 2030. Okay? If we don't do that, we're sunk. Okay? And then we get the irreversible turning points, and we slowly, slowly sink into chaos, oblivion, etc. Okay? That's the first date that's a hard date, 2030, and then there's 2050, in which you have to be at zero. There is absolutely no way we're going to make it in the 2030. And more people are realizing that. Virtually everybody realizes that. And now what has been revealed is how much, with the Putin war, how much actually of the stuff was fakery. The Germans and the atomic, and we're Greens, and then they're still buying secretly gas. Okay? It's all theater, political theater. At 2030, when it becomes clear that we're not going to make it, there's going to be a great pall, a great understanding, and things are going to begin falling apart. At that point, places like I'On are the survivors. And the other places are going to fall apart slowly and lose value. Okay? The problem with this discussion right now is that it's about the present and the past. And I keep thinking, oh boy, this sounds like the 20th century. You know, very little has been said that we didn't know in the 20th century of new urbanism. If we look forward, and by the way, our power is the future. It's not the present, it's the future. We've always said, you know, when I'On was conceived, it was conceived for 25 years out. Seaside was conceived 40 years out. If we include time as our repertoire, which is not available to anybody else, including the other developments that only have a 7-year window to make all their money, because all the spreadsheets say we have to be out of here in 7 years. Everybody else is trammeled by presentism. The future, time, is our ally. And we should be designing places and begin to talk about places that are going to be surviving the chaos and the disruptions and the hurricanes, okay, including social disruption. The falling apart of civilization is our friend. Do you understand? It's the medieval cities were the finest cities still in Europe, you know. We visit them, we love them. The walls that you showed, those were done, you began with the walls, Vince, all the walls. Those were highly stressed situations in which people had to be mixed use, from the duke to the stable hand. The stable hand needed the duke, and the duke needed the stable hand, okay? And they coalesced backwards from a very hostile place. This is very difficult to believe, but the marketing, we should begin right now, marketing for a dismal future and back them into places that will survive. And we should speak about how those places are going to lose value. Are you crazy living in that place? What do you think? You're going to find gasoline? What do you think Costco is going to deliver? Strawberries? You know, and just bite the bullet and start talking about, honestly, because everybody else is, what the collapse looks like and how our communities will be the survivors. You know, and that's the hammer that's our friend. And we refuse to do that. We have joined the people who say, oh, we're going to solve climate change. We're part of the solution. We're not, it's useless. There's very little that we can do about mitigation. There's everything that we can do about adaptation. Okay, and so I'm really looking forward to the crisis of 2030. Okay, And already we're beginning to market communities saying, if you do this, you survive. Your value will be retained. Now, not forever, but how does 2 or 3 generations sound? Pretty damn good compared to nothing. And so I would just urge us to start thinking about the future and not be reliving the past or even the present experience. Just because that's our power is time. Okay, so.